Okie dokie, I think we'll get started just a minute early. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. My name is Mia Akbar. This is Maria Jose Gomez Quijano, and we're supervised by Dr. Rob Colati, and we're really thrilled to have you all here. Before we get into our talks, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to acknowledge all of the things and the people and our funders that went into this. So. First things first, it feels important to say that the three of us are from Queen's University, which is situated on the land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. As settler scientists working in colonial institutions, we recognize that we have the responsibility to engage critically with the ideologies and guiding ethics behind our theory and our research. And we strive to engage with decolonial practices and methods that have been put forward by Indigenous scholars. And we're very committed to trying to make space for voices and perspectives that have been erased by dominant science. I'll introduce this by telling a little bit of a story. The idea for this symposium was birthed when Maria Jose and I were in the field together last summer, reading through a methodological text called Pollution is Colonialism by, thank you, Dr. Max Liboiron. There's lots of information about decolonial methodology and how to integrate that into our STEM research programs. So we were gaining all of these big ideas. Maria Jose was also simultaneously part of a working group that was developing an anti-oppression and STEM curriculum for the university that we're a part of, and it was an interdisciplinary working group. And we were also trying to reconcile these really big feelings we were having as justice-driven people from positionalities that aren't necessarily represented well in evolutionary biology, and realizing that so much of the theory that we engage with has really dark origins that we tend to dance around, even though many of us know that because it's really difficult to know where to start. And this came together with also the fact that last summer, while we're having all these big feelings, these big discussions, you know how it is in the field, there was a paper published in a prominent journal that used classic Fisher assortative mating models to make a hereditarianism argument about the heritable basis of social class. And it was really icky, and we were outraged that it was published, and in general the community was very outraged as well. But it kind of was this perfect link of all of the things that we were already thinking about how that can't be in the past because it was simply used to publish in this very, very prominent journal. So we frantically Teams messaged Rob, and we were like, Rob, we have to talk about this. We have to write a paper. And he said, well, what if we did a symposium instead? And we said, okay. And then that was the birthplace of this. And with some funding from the Levana Gender Advocacy Center in Kingston, PSAC 901, which is our graduate student union, doing also incredible work, and the very patient and accommodating support from the scientific committee of the organizing committee for this conference, specifically Marjorie Weber. We were able to invite 3 phenomenal speakers to give talks today, so we're very excited about that. Just some ground rules for how this session will be running. We ask that everyone please hold their questions for our 3 speakers until the end, where we'll have an open question period and also a reciprocal discussion period, just to encourage productive discussion so that we can all be in conversation together, because that feels like the point for us. So with that, we will go on with the show, and I will welcome our first speaker, Dr. Haley Branch, to give her talk.
Oh yeah, and the PDF is awful.
Should that be okay? And then, sorry,
That's
you're in
okay.
the way.
That's okay. Alrighty. Hi everyone. My name is Haley Branch. I am a postdoc at Yale University in Jen Coughlin's lab. and I'm also a disabled scientist. And so today I'm going to be talking a bit about ableism as a foundation for evolutionary biology, and a bit more just about who I am. So I study monkey flowers. That's kind of my bread and butter. But for a long while now, I've been this advocate for accessibility. So I use a wheelchair, as you can see, not always. So it's ambulatory use. And this kind of all started for me thinking, actually, when I first started in undergrad, my first evolutionary ecology class, I remember feeling really awkward and out of place in that classroom. And at the time, I didn't have any diagnoses. Diagnosis is not always the key to any of this. There's a lot of disabled people who aren't diagnosed. But I just remember having this deep pit in me whenever we were talking about certain aspects of evolution. And I mean, part of that was having to read Jerry Coyne, which I'm happy to talk about at another time. But a lot of it also just comes from these axiological assumptions that we make in evolutionary biology. And this is actually what we deem as valuable and important in life. And these all are culturally stemmed from. And so in evolutionary biology, it comes from this background of white, heteronormative, Christian, Western, male framework. And so all of our assumptions are really built off of this. And there's a lot of key players in our field that we constantly are citing and discussing who have roots in eugenics and these assumptions, even those that we deem and we lift up as being kind of better in the field, have still been key members of eugenics societies. Fisher was brought up a second ago, but Fisher also advocated for voluntary sterilization of disabled people. And this was to prevent the prevalence of feeble-mindedness and grave transmissible defects in the population. And this is still very relevant because disabled people are still being sterilized in the US and in Canada. And I don't know too much about the EU, but I'm sure that's probably happening as well. And so when we go through this from our baseline assumptions that are just inherent in us to all the way to our interpretations, it actually plays a key important role. So what we value dictates what we know, and so what we learn and what we grow up knowing. And then this actually will affect how we might think of acquiring said knowledge, and then that's often in a colonial aspect, that kind of methodology, the sources that we use to test these, the sources that we use to understand these, so the people that we're citing, the places that we gain this knowledge from, and then overall our interpretation of those results. And if we're thinking about evolution, a lot of it ends up being something along the lines of survival of the fittest, even though as a group, we've all acknowledged that this term is not a term to be used, and that we always, you talk to evolutionary biologists and they say, oh, well, that wasn't, Darwin didn't come up with that. It's true, but Darwin did adopt it in the 5th iteration of The Origin. So it's actually, he did decide that it was the truth. And this continues throughout our education. And so if you ask anyone who is maybe not in our field, this is what they know about evolution. They don't know any other mode of evolution. They just know survival of the fittest. And while I've been told many times, well, it's not our duty to inform the general public, it is. And at the same time, I still didn't know this until probably, I don't know, I was a master's student, so maybe there is a problem in our education system. And I actually didn't consider myself an evolutionary biologist until my second year of my PhD. So, and I think part of that probably was some type of inherent fear that I had. And some of this is from one of my dear colleagues and friends, Daniel Piers, who mentioned to me once that we're missing approximately 25% of the population's perspective on virtually everything. And so in the United States, at least, the statistics say that there's about 25% of the population that is disabled. And this is just a quick little diagram of just in academia, how we actually see, so on the top here, we have this yellow, orangey dotted line, and that's the US percentage of disabled folks. And then along the y-axis, we have the proportion, and then the academic stage. And so you can see that it declines at every stage. But we know that disability increases with age, and so that's the complete opposite of what you would expect. And so one of the things a lot of the disabled community likes to say is it's not about if you're disabled, it's about when you're disabled. And so here I have US and Canada. You'll see the yellow dotted line again. The Canada percentage is much higher. There's about 35% that identify as disabled versus American. And yeah, so you'll see that this increases across the age groups. There's also something else here to take note of is they only looked at men and women, no other genders, but in Canada, in general, women tend to have a higher percentage of being disabled than men. Can I go to the next one? Okay, this is for the EU. And so there's a similar trend in general, but then this is also for all these different countries, and you'll see that on average, about almost 30% of women identify as being disabled, whereas it's about 24% of men. And you can think about these in all kinds of different ways, whether it's that women are, on average, more disabled because of access to health care, less research is done for women's health. It could also be the stigma around disability for men. And so we see this same trend across different places. And so there's this intersectionality aspect to think about when we're thinking about disability. So when we're missing 25%, we're also missing other marginalized groups. And in terms of, so Black and Indigenous people also are more likely to be disabled than white people. And that is also attributed to lack of access to healthcare and lack of research around their healthcare. And in the workplace, white disabled folks are 10% more likely to get accommodated than their BIPOC peers. There's also the intersection of being queer and disabled, where 40% of disabled queer men reported discrimination and harassment in the workplace compared to their non-disabled peers, which was about, I believe, 25%. And then for transgendered people, there's a much higher rate of disability in the transgender community as well, and a lot more discrimination as we've been seeing, especially in the last few years in the United States, and I will mention in Canada especially too, which people always forget about. So I know this is supposed to be about citation, but really it's about we don't really have a lot of disabled people to cite. So how do we get more disabled people actually in academia, specifically in EEB? One of the key things I think is really shifting our education, so at the undergrad level, changing the way that we talk about it. I think a lot of the time we try to be more simple in our first year level courses, but that I think is the inappropriate way to go. I think we can discuss evolution in a more complicated, complex way to first-year undergrads than we give them credit for. And then making field trips and field courses accessible. And I don't mean just physically accessible. There's all kinds of ways that things can be inaccessible. And this is really important because we all talk about how important field work is. We know that it is important, even though we also, a lot of people are just laboratory based, but those with field experience tend to have better chances of getting into graduate schools. And so a bit about just my experience doing field work. I had an opportunity in undergrad to do field work, which has a whole nother thing about just my socioeconomic status of being able to go into the field. But this was a very formative time for me. I was in my 3rd year of undergrad, and I fell in love with this plant. It's tattooed on me. It is why I study stress in angiosperms, and specifically in desert plants. But I remember on that trip, I was the only person who was using canes, apart from the professor that I was with. And hiking sticks are very common, but no one would slow down for me, and I felt very alone. And I remember not really wanting to go back into the field, even though this was very formative for me. A few years later, right before my PhD, I got to do some amazing field work. And this is where I learned that I can be in the field for a long period of time. I just need a bed and a bath, which might seem luxurious to a lot of people who think you have to be camping and in the deep woods to do proper field work. But there's all kinds of ways to make field work accessible. And so just a bit of a plug about something that I've been working on for my NSF PRFB is that I'm actually assessing the 27 sites, maybe not the Antarctic site, but the other sites in the US for the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And I'm going to them and creating a database on accessibility so individuals can go and learn about what is available to them, and doing an actual video walkthrough, which will, I hope, help not just disabled people, but also individuals who want to know, for instance, how many rooms are located in a specific area? Do you share corridors? Can you lock your door? We have seen a lot of increase in sexual harassment at sites as well. So I'm hoping that with this type of information, we'll be able to get more people going into the field. And so with that, I know it wasn't really about citation politics, but it does bleed into it. That's all I have to say. So thank you.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Jed. I'm a staff scientist in Arbel Harpak's lab at UT Austin. For about another week, I'm going to be starting a visiting faculty position at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota later this fall. So today we'll be going in a slightly different direction, a lot of similar themes in terms of kind of the forbearance of our field. So today we'll be talking about hereditarianism. If you're not familiar with this term, I'll quote some colleagues here, but hereditarianism is a school of thought that contends there are substantial evolved cognitive and behavioral differences among groups of humans which are both resistant to environmental intervention and are a root cause of differential social outcomes across groups. And so when we talk about citational politics, hereditarianism is a really useful lens to think about not just the politics of kind of our internal citation practices, but the politics in the broader sphere. So hereditarianism, I want to emphasize again that was essentially one and the same with our field at its origin. So folks like Francis Galton and Fisher and all the others that were described earlier were sort of de facto hereditarians who sparked the eugenics movement and all of the atrocities associated with that. But even persisting into the latter half of the 20th century, groups like the National Front, a far-right extremist group in the UK, latched onto sociobiology as kind of foundational to its ideological platform. More recently, the Buffalo shooter in 2022, there's a lot of emphasis on the manifesto that he released and the several pages that he dedicated to kind of unpacking these hereditarian arguments as justification for his violence. This is a picture of the gun that he used, and amongst embellishments with the names of other mass shooters above the trigger, he had the name of James Watson, who has been very instrumental in advancing these hereditarian claims in the last several decades. And then, this kind of trickles throughout our whole information ecosystem, and there's been some interesting pieces on this resurgence of, hipster eugenics and designer babies and all of the horrific things that our technology might be introducing and already is. And so I don't study a charismatic model organism in any sense, so you're going to get a mythological one today. And so so in my work, so I'm a human population geneticist by training, but in graduate school, I took an interest in kind of the more meta-research angle and trying to unpack, how research in our field is communicated, who's engaging with it, what are the kind of latent impacts of that work that we're not acknowledging and not even seeing a lot of the time. And so this has led into kind of a whole arm of my research in, kind of unpacking the meta-research angle of all of this. And so hereditarianism, I think, can be described in terms of two broad categories. The first is these scholarly practices, which I'll get into, of mirroring and exploiting and leveraging scientific norms. On the other side of things, we have their engagement practices, how they're cultivating a network of supporters and essentially turning their claims into propaganda beyond the scientific norms of publishing and then giving talks and whatnot. And then there's other things to contend with too in terms of their willingness to harass and disparage those who oppose them. So I'll walk through some examples of each of these. So when I say hereditarians mirror and exploit scientific norms, again, I want to reemphasize, this was not always the case. The hereditarianism was the scientific norm for quite a long time. Following World War II and the UNESCO statements on race in the 1950s, there was kind of this rift between what we would call now mainstream science and the more hereditarian perspective. And this manifested in a lot of interesting ways. They basically started to construct their own kind of alternate academic universe. So they established their own journals like Mankind Quarterly. This was a journal established by Nazi sympathizers in the US, kind of the premier hereditarian journal for several decades and still in existence. They kind of developed their own public intellectuals. So folks like William Shockley and Arthur Jensen. Again, just kind of created this alternate ecosystem. But today, as we're developing these new open science practices and democratizing the ability to generate and access scientific research, that there is a dark side to this in the sense that anybody can post a preprint to bioRxiv. Here's one from a few years ago that eventually was published in Mankind Quarterly, the journal you see on the left. Here's another example in another preprint server. Has kind of an innocuous sounding title, but so this is a preprint server that uses an open peer review model similar to eLife. And then they get this nice little badge that says peer approved. And what I think is interesting about this example is the author is using the same signals that we do to kind of assert authority and expertise. He has this academic affiliation with university in Italy. As far as I can tell, this is where he did his undergraduate research, or his undergraduate education more than a decade ago, and he actually has no existing affiliation with that university. And so, you really see these scientific norms being exploited across the board, but also trying to re-merge them with what we now consider mainstream science by exploiting these open science practices. As Mia mentioned earlier, this paper by Gregory Clark, an economist at UC Davis, this is the title of an original draft of that paper that was circulating that had this very kind of triggering title that says genetics determines most social outcomes based on his analysis of pedigree data from England from several centuries. So myself and some colleagues who, is that Reese back there? Hi, Reese. Good to see you. So myself and some colleagues took issue with this, as many others did, and we basically did a full-blown reanalysis of this paper to show that really the claims have, they hold no water in addition to just being kind of patently absurd. These claims can't even be determined because Clark was using data that's perfectly confounding the transmission of genetic and non-genetic factors. He basically attributed every source of similarity between family members as genetic, when we know that culture and wealth and all of these other non-genetic factors are transmitted in similar patterns. But this is a theme throughout a lot of contemporary hereditarian research in taking big, impressive data sets and brushing what we'd actually know about genetic inheritance under the rug to advance these claims. And so this is something that Arvel and I, in particular, have really been focusing on in trying to systematically work through how confounding is advancing these hereditarian claims. Third arm of this is this breaching of ethical boundaries. Again, a big motivation for hereditarian scholars is to kind of shoehorn their work back into the mainstream, but there are barriers to their ability to access data. These are good barriers in that protected data is protected for a reason. But there's been instances of recently a professor basically accessed protected NIH data under false pretenses, shared it in unsanctioned ways, and violated a number of kind of procedural things along the way. Actually, he's now suing the university that fired him, and I've been following the lawsuit closely, and they just released discovery documents yesterday basically showing emails between him and his co-authors saying that this was deliberate. They said, we're going to access this data under false pretenses to study what we want to and then publish on what we want to. So pretty juicy legal documents there, if that's your thing. But more generally, there's been other papers that have been retracted for other people sifting through the literature, finding basically demonstrating unethical research practices or failing to get IRB approval and whatnot. In a recent commentary for Stat News with some colleagues, we dug into the work of Richard Lynn, one of the most prominent hereditarian scholars of the latter 20th century, and argued that his papers and those that rely heavily on the data that he generated should be retracted because of cherry-picked data and the ideological tilt of that. Lynn was quoted at one point as saying he wanted to have a go at the rehabilitation of eugenics, which is about as transparent as you can get. Switching over to the engagement side of things, so this is a figure from a paper I wrote with my postdoc advisor, Kelly Harris, back in 2020. What we did here was we were interested in who's engaging with bioRxiv preprints on Twitter. And so we devised this measure of basically the fraction of a paper's Twitter audience that's embedded within white nationalist, white supremacist networks. And we quantified that across hundreds, 1,800 preprints. And we found that across bioRxiv categories, not even just evolutionary biology, genetics, genomics, across bioRxiv categories, we often see papers with an enrichment of engagement from these groups. And in extreme cases, more than half of the audience is actually coming from those networks, which really demonstrates that we've lost the plot on communicating our own work when it's been kind of subverted by extremist communities to that degree. But beyond this kind of general cultivating anonymous Twitter accounts, they've also captured the attention of wealthy elites. So there's some articles on Elon Musk and the accounts that he's been amplifying in recent months, and some other really meticulous investigative journalism on how wealthy donors are funneling money into into the hands of these hereditarian scholars to continue doing their work. So they've undoubtedly been successful in their efforts to cultivate these networks. So we're on 5 of 6 here. We're nearing the end. But in other previous work of mine, so this is a paper that came out with Kevin Bird in Frontiers in Genetics earlier this year. It was actually a bad time to publish anything in Frontiers journals. You were on social media in February or so. Just, yeah, Google that. But anyway, so this, what's shown here in this first panel is a figure from a paper looking at the genetic diversity of human populations. So we have our little phylogeny and PCA plot and structure plot. And what we did was we looked through social media posts on 4chan, a common forum for the far right, and Twitter and elsewhere, and basically showed that this figure is getting kind of remixed and annotated and evolving into these different memes to communicate different hereditarian messages. In a commentary that I wrote with some colleagues in Nature in 2022, we actually quantified how these different memes are being posted over time on places like 4chan. And you can see there's very steady growth of, so each line there is a different meme and kind of its trajectory on 4chan, or the posting frequency on 4chan. And so not only is there really steady growth of these over time, but they seem to spike in correspondence with offline events. So around the murder of George Floyd in 2020, the 2020 US election, and other major offline events, we see these types of memes, spike in frequency of being posted. And there's actually some other papers that have replicated this for other things too. So again, like the propaganda machine is very strong here. And so finally, with Twitter and social media just kind of being what it is today, there's been a really troubling trend, and this has always been the case, but it's kind of taken on new forms. But this trend of disparaging topical experts and any scientists who might dare to confront or contradict hereditarians. So on the top here is a well-known, well-respected statistical geneticist basically asserting the expert consensus on that there's no evidence of a genetic basis for a gap in racial IQs, and someone responding and saying you're a documented liar and this is a misinformation campaign, which is absurd. And there's even entire blog posts and Substack posts denigrating specific individuals, yeah, it's really, really concerning to see your colleagues talked about in this way. And when, yeah, there's certainly a power imbalance in terms of, how hereditarians, the lengths they're willing to go to sort of win an argument and suppress, yeah, the experts who are actually experts on things. And so, last quick slide. I'm not going to be prescriptive about how we can confront any of these. I have some ideas up here. I guess to summarize the scholarly practices side of things. So I think we just continue to need to be vigilant and double down on our own scholarship. Reassessing the risks and benefits of open science norms. Scientific rebuttal is. We like to tell ourselves that science is self-correcting, but it's really not. There's very few incentives to actually confront flawed research. Basically, whoever publishes first always has the upper hand. And then, of course, improving our training and motivating action in responsible research and accountability is huge for addressing these ethical breaches. And then on the engagement side, I think there's maybe some room to take a cue from the hereditarians themselves. We can strengthen and expand our interactions with journalists and the public, and kind of reassert our own expertise in the public sphere to counter the propagandization of their work, I see lots of opportunities for us to improve our data visualization and communication strategies. And finally, this is all a community confrontation. There's no one person who's doing all of this. So really supporting peer scientists who are experiencing abuse and harassment, and stepping up to support one another. And so with that, I want to thank my many collaborators, several of whom aren't even shown on this slide, who have really contributed to my research and my thinking on this. So thank you all so much.
Good afternoon, folks. I want to thank you for attending the session today, and I apologize for not being there in person. Have a number of other community obligations that has kept me here on the West Coast, but I'm very thankful to Maria Jose and the rest of the organizers for allowing me to record a talk and present it to you virtually. And so my talk is titled The Art of Citational Politics, and it's a little bit of a smorgasbord of my thoughts about how we cite things, about what the canon is, and about how we in my own lab at the University of Victoria kind of approach citational politics when we do work in our lab and we do work with Indigenous communities. And so to introduce myself, I'm Neo Kamigawa DeAndre Smiles. I'm an assistant prof in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria here in BC, Canada. And again, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you all today, I guess a little bit asynchronously, although I think I'm supposed to be part of the Zoom, so I'll be available for questions here at the end of the talk. So, citational politics, it's something that we are faced with all the time in academia, but people have trouble kind of defining, well, what is it? How do I navigate citational politics, and what does it mean to do good citational politics or do not so good citational politics? And so I'll kind of start out by talking through the way that I've kind of approached citations and the way that, we are in, as they say, in conversation with the literature, with the canon, things of that nature. And so back when I was a young graduate student, which actually wasn't that long ago, I'm 33 going on 34, so I was a master's student 10 years ago. When I was going through graduate school and even kind of in the latter half of my undergraduate career, I was taught about something called the Burkean parlor when we talk about literatures that we're in conversation with and the way that we cite things and the things that we engage with when we do academic work. And so the Burkean parlor, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the idea of knowledge, the idea of writing, the idea of like constructing what we call the quote literature, is an ongoing conversation around a proverbial table where people come in and leave, yet the conversation continues. I was always kind of taught to think of it as like this big dinner table where I would be sitting at the end of it or like in the middle of the table, and my graduate school advisors and mentors told me in this so-called intellectual parlor, think about the people that I would want to be in conversation with. Like if I wanted to have a dinner party and talk about my work, and I could invite anybody from academia, who would be the people that I would invite? And so that's the way that I thought about it for a long time, right? And when I write, and I still think about this a little bit, and I'll go into this a little bit later, when I write, who are the people I want to be in conversation with? What sort of conversation is happening? And what do I want to add to the conversation? What is it that I want people to be talking about with me here at this so-called Burkean parlor? And so I thought about that for the longest time, again, before I really knew about what citational politics were. And I came to realize that there can be an issue when we think about it solely in these sorts of frameworks. And that brings us to kind of the idea of the canon, right? And so the canon being that, all of the foundational texts, everything that kind of constitutes the development of knowledge in various disciplines. I feel like almost every single discipline in academia has a canon of some form, right? In geography, we certainly do. And there's kind of this prevailing thought that I've often found since graduating from grad school and becoming an academic professional, kind of this idea that the canon is something that you have to pay homage to, right? That you have to respect the people that have written about these things before you. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was writing a chapter for a geography methods handbook, I was explicitly told, well, you need to cite A, B, and C because these are the people that have been kind of trailblazing and really making the work possible in the canon. And this is fine, right? I mean, obviously, we have those foundational texts, we have those foundational pieces of knowledge that are necessary for us to be able to make our work legible. But it also creates these situations where certain citations, certain books, certain readings becomes almost indispensable to knowledge production. Again, this isn't a bad thing, but sometimes this could end up inhibiting certain forms of knowledges from more visibility. One of the most prominent examples that I bring up that sometimes gets me in trouble is the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Robin is an amazing academic. I've met her. I have a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass. It is an awesome book. But a lot of people have read it, and all of a sudden they're like, well, this is an important citation for any kind of Indigenous environmental work, and they use terms like braiding out of it. And it's one of those things where I'm like, well, that is, it's a really, really good book. Robin's a great author, as I said, but she's writing about that from a certain viewpoint. She's Potawatomi, and she's writing about it from a Potawatomi viewpoint, which may not be applicable to all Indigenous contexts. Other things, like one of my biggest love-hate relationships is with Michel Foucault, right? As somebody who did critical geography as a graduate student, I always found myself having to return to Discipline and Punish in the History of Sexuality. But then I also would deal with this existential angst of like, well, do I need to cite Foucault in order to talk about Indigenous resistance and Indigenous governmentalities? Like, is this something that I'm like shackled to? And so it kind of creates a situation where a lot of times when you're doing like Indigenous work, it becomes something where you have these other citations that may or may not fit with the work that you're doing, but you're almost obligated to have to cite them. And to me, that can create situations where, one, it's obscuring Indigenous work, but also, two, it also means that you're having to cite something for the sake of citing it, which means that you're not reading it as deeply, which also means that you're also doing that citation a disservice. One of the things that oftentimes comes up when we bring in Indigenous scholarship kind of into canon or literary conversations or disciplinary conversations is people say, well, that's not rigorous science. One of the things that I remember running into in my time on the job market is that one time at a job interview somewhere in North America was giving my job talk, and I talked about the ways that I did Indigenous research methodologies. And because of those research methodologies, I would anonymize the people who I did work with, right? Because I wanted to make sure that they were safe, and also if they don't consent to being named in public-facing scholarship, then they just don't get named. And one of the faculty who listened to my talk said, this is really, really great, like you're doing good work, but in actual science, you would never be allowed to obscure the sources of your data. And I was like, well, what would that mean from like, scholarship out there that explicitly surrounds this, right? Are we just subscribing to an idea of science as something where all information is just open, which can be harmful in itself? But also it points to Indigenous knowledge as being portrayed as non-rigorous and non-scientific. That because we embrace the interconnected and intersectional nature of our identities when we do this work, that it's therefore not detached, it's not empirical, it's not true science. This happens particularly in critical human geography, right? Indigenous scholarship is viewed as something that enhances dominant science rather than something that stands on its own. I gave the example of braiding sweetgrass for an example, right? A good mentor of mine, Max Barone, kind of talks about this as, they call it add Indigenous and stir. What they mean by this is it's always that Indigenous knowledge just simply enhances dominant knowledge that's there. It's not something that is viewed as being worthy in its own right. And so, for example, when we talk about citational politics, it might be that, oh, sure, well, you can cite all these Indigenous peoples, but you also have to bring it in conversation with, Guattari or Deleuze or Foucault or Marx or Weber or any of these other, this kind of pantheon of European philosophers that, again, kind of my area of scholarship. And I'm like, well, what would it look like to just have Indigenous scholarship stand on its own, right? Do I need to have to put it through a lens of dominant science for it to have legibility? And so I've started to think about citational politics in a bit of a different way, right? And so instead of kind of thinking about the canon, I think more kind of based off of, work that I learned while I was in the CLEAR lab, run by Dr. Max Barone, about academic kin. This comes out of kind of a core value of the CLEAR Lab, where they think about the work that they do as a set of relations, where it's not just academic research, but it also is how are we being in good relation to the land and the people that we're working with? How is it that we can be respectful to them? How is it that we are uplifting, marginalized people and disrupting existing power dynamics? And so for me, citations are also a set of relations, right? The people that I choose to cite, the people that I choose to look to for my work, it says a lot about what's important to my work, and it says a lot about what's important to me in the message that I want to get across. And so I kind of ask these kind of questions when I'm thinking about who to cite. I'm like, who are the people who I'm accountable to with my scholarship? Who are the people that I have to show gratitude for making space for me, right? Who am I writing for? It's not just, well, somebody wrote X, Y, and Z, and it was a foundational text in geography 50 years ago, so I have to cite that. It's like, who are the people that I really, truly want to be in relation with? Not just conversation with, but actually want to be in relation and build reciprocal relationships. Those are the people that I want to cite. And so sometimes that means that, I'm putting out a publication and like 100% of the citations are Indigenous. Sometimes it might mean that, there's a mixture of both, right? It's all dependent on what are the sort of relations that I want to build. This also comes across in the work that we do here in my own lab, the Geographic Indigenous Future Lab. We do publications as well. As a matter of fact, one is in review as we speak. I recognize that when we do these publications, when we do outward-facing scholarship, it's going to end up out there in the so-called academic canon, quote, and it could be cited itself. And so I kind of view these as opportunities to position our publications and our outward-facing products in ways that can benefit those who may not always benefit from citational politics as they are currently constituted, right? And so, it may be that, for example, I guess some people, view me as fairly prominent. I wouldn't say that for myself, of course, but it might be that if DeAndre Smiles is the first author on a publication, it's going to get cited, but that's not really what's important to me. That's just reifying another dynamic where, because I am the person with more institutional power and privilege, that therefore my name needs to go first in order to make sure that's being read. And I'm like, well, no, it's actually the people that put in work into these publications are the ones that deserve the credit. And so community members and junior lab members, for example, in any lab publication that we do, they are almost always of a higher authorship order. And of course, there's a process of determining authorship order, but it's always, I am never one of those people where I'm like, I need to be first or second author. I'm like, who is going to benefit the most from being higher up on the authorship order? Those are the people that should be there. And myself, I would be low on the author order, and there may even be publications where my name doesn't show up at all because it is the work of other people in the lab, and I want to make sure that they're being recognized for that. So like I said, it's kind of a little bit all over the place when talking about citational politics, but given the limited time that we have, I wanted to give you a snapshot into the thinking that I go through when I kind of think about these sorts of things. And so miigwech, gigawabamin, thank you. Hopefully we'll look forward to talking with you in the question and answer session, and I hope that you have a good rest of the conference.
All right, and so what we are gonna do right now is I'm gonna kind of put everything that we've talked about today kind of in context, and the idea is to have a Q&A session, but also really encouraging discussion from the people attending. So if there's things you want to share, or other than questions or in any ideas, we really want this to be a space where we create a discussion and a community, because this is, in our view, work that needs to be done by all of us, and we want all of us to have agency over how we move forward and how we keep developing these ideas and this work. And so, and then DeAndre will be on Zoom, and I'll set that up in 2 seconds. But kind of going back and putting everything back into context, it's really not a secret that many evolutionary biologists that it's not a secret for any of us, right, that our theory has roots in these dark places. And so if we even just go back to how the field of evolution started, it's rooted in colonialism. A lot of the collections that were done by Darwin and other naturalists and botanists, for example, would have not been done if it was not because there was also a process of colonization happening. And those voyages were also being excused as a way to do science at that point. And so it's really interconnected even from the beginning, and how oppression and science unfortunately have been connected for a long time. Then we move further in time. Some of the foundational models, as you've heard today, of statistics and theories that were developed by Fisher, by Galton, by Pearson, they were really used to facilitate and validate eugenics and oppress people, and kind of determine what people's life and rights should look like. And then foundational interpretations and misuses of the concept of natural selection, facilitating social Darwinism as a way to control people and as a way for other people to gain political, economic, and social power have been very prevalent even till today. And so all this misuses of scientific knowledge have really led to this social and public impacts, which, yes, we might not be fully responsible for, but we are the ones carrying the baton right now, and we are the ones who can start moving away and moving forward into more ethical ways of doing science, more ethical citations, where we incorporate and include people. So I think if you're here, you probably recognize that this problematic histories have existed, and none of us want to really perpetuate these stories, and instead we really want to do something about it. So it often feels very difficult and overwhelming on where do we start doing this? Where do we start doing the work? How do we incorporate this work also into our research? Because we're also interested in understanding how this systems and evolutionary biology work, but we also care about the world, and we recognize that there's an intersectionality with who we are and the spaces that we occupy and our own identities. And it's even more difficult to recognize that this problematic approaches are still prevalent today more than ever, and are used to continue the marginalization of people, to maintain systematic inequalities and a justification to reduce people's rights and erase their identities. So this is a search that I did this morning for 15 minutes of news articles of just things that are happening constantly that are rooted in a lot of those ideas. And this is things that are happening today that still use misuses of scientific knowledge, misuse of citations to argue that doing all these things is right. So beyond that, we really need to think that considering the politics of citation is one of the mechanisms, not the only one, but just one of the mechanisms that we can start to do to address this problematic legacies and move the field forward in terms of inclusion and evolutionary understanding about the role of queerness, disability, and indigenous knowledge, and many other identities. And so it's even more important to take a step back. And we've heard already from from all of the speakers today, the who you cite and who gets to be cited really matters. And so I'm not going to go fully through all of this, but citations really, really matter, especially because it allows us to build this networks of ideas that support and validate our research, but what we know as the reality of our world. Who we cite, it really reflects, and how we cite really reflects whose knowledge and whose ideas we are willing to include in our own work, and which ones we consider as valid, quote unquote, and is really a currency of academic success. So unfortunately, it is in the fields that we're in, citations is that currency of success, of opportunities. And it's inherently political, like science in general. And so because of it's that currency, what happens is that when you have certain people that get cited, certain ideologies that become prominent and get cited and get that also becomes this kind of cycle with whoever gets cited then also is able to get grants, then is able to get jobs, then it's able to keep moving in the career ahead of, right, and keep moving. But we also forget a lot of people that because they don't get cited, because they're not part of the prominent or the dominant groups, end up being oppressed because they don't have the same access and opportunity to grants, to jobs, to even have space to share their knowledge with people. And then becomes even more bigger issues where we end up erasing knowledge, misinforming policy, developing social prejudice, and the continuous systematic exclusion. So it becomes kind of this never-ending sink that seems to be very overwhelming and can be very overwhelming, but we really think that engaging in meaningful discussions and being really aware of who we cite and why we cite and how we choose to develop those research publications can really have an impact in at least putting kind of a stop to some of these cycles and at least trying to move them away from increasing, all this issues, and instead making it more of a equitable space, a just space, and a space where we can, where multiple groups of people are allowed to do science and to keep doing the work that we love to do, because we're all here because we love evolution, and we love science, and we love research, and we want to make sure that the same way that we've had the privilege to do it, everyone else has also the opportunity to do it as well. So with that, we will be moving into questions and discussion period. So how this is going to work is if you have any questions for any of our speakers, we kindly ask you if you can come up to the mic, just because we also have the Zoom and for also accessibility purposes. And then after that, if there's time, we'll kind of move into a little bit more of a discussion. So I will.
I really appreciated everybody's talks. I know this is a really important issue. My question is, I guess, primarily for Jedediah, but also anyone who has experience with this. Thoughts of what we should do if people at our institutions are publishing in journals that support eugenics, especially if we're coming from a position of lower power in that institution than those people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't want to be that guy that's like, it's context specific, but like I think the context of how those papers are being published, like, is it, someone publishing outside of their area of expertise? Are there like ethical, like research ethical concerns of like, was data manipulated or cherry picked, or I think I think at first blush it's an opportunity to kind of dig into the process by which that research is getting published. I think in my own journey in this, like, just understanding the thought process, or trying to understand the thought process of like, why do this work, why publish where you do, and sometimes that's pretty transparent, but yes, as far as confronting that from a power differential, I think find people to rally around and support you in that. I'm speaking from a place of extraordinary privilege in being able to do a lot of this work without concerns about that. But I think, yeah, even in my own experience, like having that support network and formal and informal folks who will go to bat for you, and finding that support can be really difficult sometimes, and I don't want to undersell the difficulty of that, but yeah, if you want to talk about it after this, I'm happy to chat more about specifics of that, but yeah, it's a messy, complex situation that involves. Yeah, it involves all of us, and it should, and I think a lot of people are resistant to being involved, and that's a huge barrier there.
I just want to underscore, I was so privileged to be involved in the project that Jed talked about, where we, but especially Jed and John did the really hard work that took a tremendous amount of time and effort to do the reanalysis, to debunk the claims in the original Clark paper, just the one example, one of Jed's examples. I think as a senior member of our community, I still had pretty strong confidence in science being self-correcting, not totally naive about that, but pretty readily corrected. And it has blown my mind how hard it is to get this rebuttal of Clark's original paper out and published. So that's discouraging, but I think I also want to underscore what Jed just said. I think as individuals, we need to be doing this confronting, but it is much bigger than individuals doing it. I have, as a senior member at my university, called into question at our research office a funding source that was announced for a member of our psychology department that looked pretty darn sketch, like the ones that Jed was referring to, the money bags that throw their money at the research that he described. And, I was told there was nothing the university would do about it. It's just, they didn't have grounds for doing anything. So we all have to keep doing the work. It will all be, I think it will be challenging for a while to come.
Hi, I have a question for our first speaker. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, I came in late. But you mentioned the fact that we should remove certain things from curriculums, like the concept of deleterious mutations. I was just wondering how you would want that to be framed. What's the positive flip side to that?
That's a great question. I wish I had this table. We published a paper about and gave some suggestions. There's also a really great website that's come out about different wording you can use. I forget what it's called, but someone's nodding. So they might remember. I'm very sorry, I don't recall what it is. The idea of mutation is not negative of any kind. It's just the way we often describe mutations tends to be in this negative light. And there can be, most mutations are benign and don't really cause any phenotypic change, or the phenotypic change is something that doesn't cause any actual downstream differences in terms of fitness. I have a lot of woes about fitness too. I got a lot of slack about that on Twitter and Elon Musk. But I guess describing mutations more of what the effect is rather than just saying that something is negative or deleterious is a better way of doing it. I always think that description is always the best philosophy. And it's always context specific. And we know that something that might present itself in one situation environment, it might look different in another environment. So just calling something deleterious or negative gives a very skewed vision of what this actually is doing, especially to, again, the general public or to undergraduate students. I think a lot of us can reason and understand what our peers are talking about, but other people don't understand, and they might just think that, oh, deleterious means it's just, or like negative just means it's bad, period. And that's not generally the case. It's just in that one specific instance, in your one, laboratory experimental study. Is it true in nature? Who knows? Is it true in every context? Maybe not. We don't have all of the information. And generally, a lot of studies that we do are so context specific that I don't know if we always actually know if something is truly deleterious in all situations. So that's kind of why I think it's not the appropriate wording to be used.
Yeah, thanks for the great talks. This is a general question for all the speakers. How would you maybe suggest combating or calling out virtue signaling? Like these often prominent PIs who say they're inclusive, they're diverse, they want to, but they're not. And it's all done for basically their Twitter feed and their public image.
Yeah. DeAndre, did you get that question?
I did not. No, it's a little difficult to hear.
I apologize. We're not well set up for hybrid. The question was how, it was for all the speakers, and it was how do you combat virtue signaling? Actually, would you mind coming up here and repeating it such that I'm not speaking for you? Thank you.
So yeah, the question was how to combat virtue signaling. There's often cases of like PIs that say they're very inclusive, they want to include people with disabilities or people of color in their labs, and it's all just done for public show. When you dig down and you hear stories from the lab, it turns out they're quite toxic environments for anybody that doesn't conform to the stereotype of Western white male scientist.
It's a good question, and I think that is a little more common than I think we'd like to admit in academia, where a lot of people want to be viewed as being inclusive, as doing the right thing, of being decolonial, and then when it comes right down to it, they reinforce toxic, dynamics and, position themselves as speaking for people. I think one of the key things that I know I try to do to make sure that I'm not tokenizing people or not trying to fetishize, trauma or disability or things, speaking as an Indigenous person who also battles chronic illness and neurodivergence. It's one of the things we constantly check in. It's like, well, why are we doing this, right? Is it really to push for their research and for their visibility, or is it just because it makes us feel good? It makes us feel like we're doing the right thing. I don't do things just, there is an intrinsic reward, obviously, in trying to support people, and I like doing the right thing, but it's something where if somebody's actually, supporting people and making space for them, it's not like people think that it's like this thing where it's like, oh my gosh, it's just really wonderful and just super positive. It can be really, really tough. I mean, especially doing advocacy in academic structures that are not built for non-white folks, for neurodiverse folks, for disabled folks. And so actually one of the key metrics I often find is, am I pissing off the people in power by doing what I'm doing, by supporting other folks? If I'm doing that, then I'm probably doing something right, because then it's something that I'm not gaining social capital by doing it, but still trying to make a meaningful difference. And so that's one sort of thing. And another thing that I always try to subscribe to is my advisor was my PhD advisor really liked the phrase "show, don't tell." And so I tend to be somebody myself where I tend to let my actions do more of the talking than say all the good things that I'm trying to do, because people will be able to
see what's going on, right? If I'm just talking about it, that's less time spent actually doing meaningful work. So I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but that's kind of how I try to avoid kind of this these sorts of things that can pop up when it comes to how do we show up for folks that may not have the institutional privilege and power that we do.
That got an amen, but no addition from the two other speakers. Yeah, we have a couple minutes. If you want to come up here, though. Thank you so much, Madeline.
Okay, thank you so much to Mia and Maho for organizing this. They're both rock stars. I am going to be that person who brings up a question about Palestine. Does anyone have any advice or recommendations for those of us trying to observe an academic boycott in alignment with BDS targets? We cite a lot of people, we don't necessarily know all of their, affiliations. How do we try to do the best we can in alignment with BDS targets?
DeAndre, do you have anything to speak to on that one?
That is $1 million question, isn't it, right? Because people's politics may not always be super apparent in their work that they're doing, right? As a matter of fact, as somebody here at UVic, our encampment just ended last week, actually, and there was a whole lot of disappointing things around the end of that. But one of the biggest disappointing things is how many decolonial scholars that position themselves as decolonial would show up to Indigenous events and speak about trying to stand up for the subaltern and for the colonized, and then when it comes to actual genocide, being really quiet or being like, well, that makes me feel uncomfortable because of X, Y, and Z. I think one of the biggest things is one of the biggest things I'd probably say is try not to hold yourself up to a model of purity politics, right? But just be, but also, see the people that are openly doing the work, right? And, those are the folks that you want to surround yourself with if you're trying to do citational politics in that kind of a way.
Thank you so much. I think it is 12:30 now, and the gong just sounded on us, so I think that we'll probably have to conclude here for now. This is something that we are very interested in, and so actually first I'll just say thank you all for coming. I think I speak for both Maria Jose and I when we say it's scary to be early career people coming to an international evolutionary biology conference and telling people that they shouldn't cite Fisher. It's not been met warmly at home, and we're really grateful for our supervisor for providing a space and the safety for doing that, but also for all of you for showing up and being in conversation with us to show that we are interested in this and we wanted to do this. So if you have other ideas that were inspired by today or that you've been thinking of for a while, we would really love to hear from you. You can find us at the Kaladi Lab website and our emails and all of our contact information there. So please get in touch. And please, one more time, thank our speakers for joining us and for giving these talks.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference.